Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 2nd of April, 2025. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Charles Mallett, and joining me in the studio today is Mike Robinson. Welcome to the programme, Mike.
Thanks, Charles.
Also, we have Vanessa Beeley and Sandy Adams joining by video link. It'll be a full programme today, as always, and we'll be looking at the themes of, persistent themes, I suppose, of freedom of speech and censorship and what's been going on in various parts of the Middle East, as well as migration. But we're going to start with freedom of speech, Mike.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Charles. Last Thursday, the Metropolitan Police raided the Westminster Quaker Meeting House to arrest 6 women who had met to discuss Gaza, amongst other things. Climate was one of the other things. Now, this group of women were part of what was described as a welcome meeting for an organisation called Youth Demand, which calls itself a non-violent protest group. Now, here's their website. Sorry, here's their website, if we can get it to work. Sorry about that. Here we go. Now, you'll look at the style of this and you might say that it's very reminiscent of the style of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And in fact, their activists carry out a very similar style of protest, using spray paint, for example, defacing works of art and so on. So now the police themselves handcuffed the women and seized their belongings, and they were then taken to the police station. And their student flats were raided and searched. The police were armed with tasers. And though I totally disagree with the style of protest that these organizations use, protest, is one thing, criminal damage is another, particularly items of cultural significance. But there is the possibility that these organizations are in fact agents of the state. But whether or not that's the case, their tactics are certainly being used by the state as an excuse for limitations on protest and for exactly the type of police activity that we're seeing here. Now, going back to this Quaker press release that on their website, they, aside from thanking everyone for their support, they're saying the following: that since the introduction of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 and the Public Order Act 2023, the right to protest has been severely restricted. Vague and sweeping definitions, that's my emphasis, by the way, vague and sweeping definitions mean that even discussing peaceful protest can be criminalized. They go on to say this is not just about the actions of the police, but about laws that undermine democracy itself. In a democratic society, people must have the right to assemble and to speak out, even when their views challenge those in power. We've been reporting the issue of freedom of speech related to Gaza for quite some time now, and Richard Medhurst, a perfect example of this. With people in the UK being arrested by the British regime under terror legislation. Richard Medhurst, is one of these people, and the campaign to shut him up has apparently now moved also to Austria, where he has been experiencing similar treatment to the type of treatment he's been receiving in the UK. And so we've got the UK behaving like this with people in Quaker houses. We've got, and also Richard Medhurst and Vanessa Beeley and others. We'll talk to Vanessa in a second on this, and also in Europe. But anyone that thought that the Donald Trump regime would be the bastion of free speech is getting a rude awakening there as well. Because here is a video. Let's just have a look at this. This video clip is showing a group of people in plain clothes. Now, they weren't initially masked, but they very quickly masked up. Here, from this CCTV footage, they offered no identification. They eventually said that they were the police, but they only said they were police. They didn't actually offer any proper ID. This girl was lifted without due process or explanation, and it became subsequently, it came to light that she'd been removed to a detention center in Louisiana. Now, the reason for the arrest and her removal, well, apparently it was because she was involved in writing an opinion piece for the Tufts Daily, which is a student-run newspaper at Tufts University. Now, the article criticised the university for its stance on Gaza, and in the article, there was no advocating for violence, there was no support for terrorism, there was no criticism of the US government. But even if there were, the article was published in March 2024 when Biden was president. So why it's taken them, this is clearly a new policy that we're seeing in action here. And this is happening across the United States. So she was eventually dragged off by these people, all masked up and so on. Now, just so that you can see the article, this is the op-ed, Try Again, President Kumar. This is the president of the university, renewing calls for Tufts to adopt the March 4th TCU Senate resolutions. So that was the article that they published. But what we're seeing is this behavior right across the UK, the European Union. Many people remaining silent on what's going on, perhaps because they're pro-Israel, or perhaps because they don't like Muslims too much. But I think this is a naive and dangerous position to take. What we saw in that video looked like what we might expect from the conscription gangs in Ukraine or from Nazi Germany. And Niemöller's poem comes to mind here. And that might seem like a cliche to some, but it really does, to me, seem appropriate. Vanessa, we've got about a minute there. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're seeing this complete ramping up of really Gestapo tactics, particularly from the Trump administration. The videos being put out about those that are being deported to El Salvador, for example, is just insane. And of course, the UK was leading in this kind of discrimination against anyone protesting government policy. But now, under Trump, the US seems to be catching up.
You got any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you alluded to it, but the way in which the funding of protests to engineer a particular result in the sort of problem, reaction, solution dialectic is very evident. I mean, we've seen this time and again. It's exactly what's on the horizon with the crime and policing bill now. And also, again, this very disturbing trend of any sort of implicit criticism of Israel being regarded as somehow anti-Semitic and therefore illegal or unlawful. It is an absolute disgrace. So I think that takes us into a sort of a different branch of censorship, which was talked about on Monday. But we look at Ofcom, and of course, censorship remains a persistent theme for UK Column in terms of news reporting, and with very good reason. If we can just push on the screen. But Ben and Brian spoke about it on Monday with a special reference to the influences on the so-called regulator Ofcom. And as was made clear, the central purpose of Ofcom, as far as voices which are not establishment approved are concerned, is to act as censor-in-chief. And the reason for the focus on this right now is that the parts of the Online Safety Act of 2023 are being described as coming into force. And in doing so, they're shifting the burden of responsibility for exposure to harm from the individual to the broadcasting entity. So we see here that Ofcom says that as of the 17th of March, Ofcom can now enforce against the regime. Now, not only are they able to make content providers aware of their supposed duties, but they're also empowered to enforce against the regime, as the slide shows. And critically, the specific burden, which Brian alluded to, falls upon the moderation and control of content on a platform, which may be described as user to user. So in the case of UK Column, this is a specific reference to the members' forums. And the critical distinction being made by both the Online Safety Act and Ofcom is between comments made in response to provider content, a news program, for example, and comments made in a thread which could have been started by members themselves. So where what's called user-to-user content is concerned, Ofcom is demanding that platforms provide a risk assessment in order to articulate how they will deal with content which is deemed either harmful or unlawful or both. And what's extremely important to understand here is that even if the provider, UK Column, for example, has not broadcast any contentious material, we may still be held liable for completely unrelated conduct by members in the forums. So I think the significance of this must be looked at in two specific ways. First of all, it sets a precedent online, which may be then rolled out into the real world. So, to use a perhaps oversimplistic analogy, but at the moment, if say a fight breaks out in a pub, there's no suggestion that the pub should be held liable, unless, of course, it or the landlord has conducted a particular activity which could have precipitated or incited the incident. So, to extend this analogy, the Online Safety Act would hold the pub liable regardless of whether they were hosting a punch-up themed evening or not. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to see how any sort of venue could be threatened simply because of the conduct of the people in there, and completely regardless of the sort of event held by the venue.
Just before you go on, I mean, this is why we've seen these small forums, these volunteer-led forums, closing down over the last couple of weeks in the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, the pressure and the threat, which we'll sort of come on to, is very, very evident. And of course, the expectation is that organisations will, in effect, jump before they're pushed. But the second issue is one of discrimination. And the wording of the Act is such that the targets of Ofcom's scrutiny and powers are, of course, the independent providers where users have a means of communicating with one another. And there exists a specific exemption for providers which only host user comments that are in response to provider content. So this means that if, say, the BBC or the Daily Mail host comments which reference criminal activity, say terrorism or incitement to violence or public order, they may not be held liable. Now, with regard to statute legislation, there are a couple of points to be made. Firstly, and as stated by the Crown Prosecution Service, there's an unenforceable pressure to deal with a crime if you witness one, but, as they go on to say, there's no legal obligation to do anything about it. They refer specifically to contacting the police. But, of course, the Online Safety Act turns this on its head. And also, the Interpretation Act of 1978 suggests that it is possible for companies to be discriminated against. Shown here in the Act that a person includes a body of persons, corporate or unincorporated. That goes all the way back to 1889. And this really doesn't seem to have been raised in relation to the regime of censorship. But the next thing we come to is what I would describe as an enormous conflict of interest, which is set before Ofcom, in that they're to reward themselves financially for enforcing this censorship. So this turns out to be, or could turn out to be, a very lucrative exercise. Now, last year, admittedly, they only pulled in 7 million in penalties, but they do boast that in previous years, 2018, they issued Royal Mail with a £50 million financial penalty for breaking competition law, and now they're suggesting, with the raft of powers that they have been granted, that they could fine to a value of up to 18 million, or indeed 10% of the qualifying worldwide revenue, whichever is the greater. So not only do they have a new range of enforcement powers, but they especially believe that they can interdict businesses that do not even have a UK footprint. Now, the thing to note here is that Ofcom sits within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and there can be little doubt that they would consider a success if Ofcom returned more money to them, as per the route on this diagram. So, as I said at the outset, censorship really lies at the heart of this, and Ben showed us on Monday that the Demos report suggests that we're in a democratic emergency, and I might put it that we're in an emergency of a different kind. And I think it's always worth looking back to see where this does come from, and I would therefore cite the criminal code of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, drawn up in 1924 and translated into English exactly 100 years ago, which sets out the counter-revolutionary crime. And it says here that the term counter-revolutionary is applied to any act committed with the intention of overthrowing, undermining, or weakening the authority of the workers' and peasants' government founded on the constitution of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. And the echo, I think, is impossible to ignore with the new definition of extremism in 2024, which says that extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to undermine, overturn, or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights. So obviously a lot more to talk about with regard to free speech and censorship, but we're now going to go to Vanessa, who will tell us a bit more about what Roger Waters has been doing with specific regard to the Yalta Conference of 1945.
Yes, well, the 80th Yalta Conference, where Roger Waters gave quite an incredibly moving, extraordinary speech, actually, that I've published in full at my Substack. But yeah, it was the 80th anniversary of course, the March 1945 Yalta Conference, which involved Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt to basically divide up what was left of Europe after World War II and to put the UN into motion. Roger Waters goes into some detail about the formation of the UN and the replacement of the League of Nations and so on in his speech, and I do really recommend people read it. As I said, I've published it up at my Substack. We will not move one solitary inch towards your Armageddon. So I've just taken some excerpts from the speech. First of all, so he talks about every day waking up and basically girding himself to deal with the horrors that are being produced by our various respective governments. What can I do today? What do I prepare? Why do I prepare for battle every day? Because every day we're fighting the existential battle for the soul of the human race. And I think this is something that we've all alluded to on UK Column. And he goes on to say, the truth is that what Western governments are doing when they support Israel's psychotic bloodbath is not simply justifying Israel's horrific crimes, they're also defending themselves in defense of their own indefensible imperial pasts. The entire speech is, I keep saying it, but please go and read it because it's beautifully written and it's written from the heart. And I think it sends a message to all of us who are trying to navigate the horrific scenes that we're being forced to watch as a result of our government's foreign policies. And so he ends up with saying, it is not God who is giving Israel permission to continue its murderous rampage. It is us. We can stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, face to face with Trump, with Netanyahu and Starmer, and armed with love and truth, we, the choir, will find the strength to say enough. Now, obviously, this is a very idealistic statement, but at the same time, I think he's alluding to the unity that we've been continuously talking about, that instead of allowing ourselves to be distracted and divided by the narratives that are obviously being produced exactly to do that, we should be standing against what is effectively an ongoing genocide, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in all of the global south, in Yemen right now. And unification is the only way that we are going to be able to stand and face those that are perpetrating the crimes against humanity.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. Sounds like a speech that would definitely be worth reading. Usually anything that Roger Waters says is these days either ignored or gets a pretty bad reception in the mainstream. Has there been much of a response to this?
No, not that I've seen, actually. I've just been sort of reading through the speech this morning. It's getting a good reception, of course, on various social media platforms, but I'm quite sure he will come in for some flack at some point, probably more from the Trump administration than anywhere else. If you remember, it was Robert Kennedy Jr. who led the attack against him previously.
Absolutely, indeed. Vanessa, thank you very much indeed. Now, we're going to come to Sandy, who spoke last week about it's a couple of weeks ago, I think now, about sanctuary cities. So I think you have an update for us, Sandy.
Yes, I mean, following on from last week's article I did on Monday on sanctuary cities. On Monday evening, Weston-super-Mare Town Council voted 11 to, I think it was 11 to 14, to become a city of sanctuary, despite growing concerns from the people of Weston. About 200 people turned up at the town hall to raise their concerns, and it was deemed a protest, which I thought was quite interesting, by the council. I mean, these are just concerned citizens worried about, whether the town can sustain this amount of people. So there'd been no public consultation consultation on this, and there was a motion in place to defer the vote, which was overruled. So people keep asking, what's going on? I mean, Starmer vowed to smash the gangs, right? And so far, we're just seeing no attempt to smash these so-called gangs bringing in the boats. And it's causing massive division here. I mean, that's the problem. So is there a government operation fulfilling this role? And I've looked into the early European Union and what really happened. And some people speak of a long-term plan called the Kalergi plan from the 1920s. So I thought I'd take a deep dive into this because it does seem that there was Kalergi did exist. It's not a conspiracy theory. And he wrote a book called Practical Idealism in I think it was 1925. And he was the founder of the Pan-European movement, which was the first serious proposal for European unification at the time. And you look at the index for his book, and that there's a lot of talk about technocracy, elitism, and breeding and interbreeding, and sort of there's a lot of it's a globalist blueprint really, and not one rooted in egalitarian democracy. It's rather led by a sort of an enlightened elite, he calls it. And Kalergi was born in 1864. He was of mixed race. His father was an Austrian aristocrat, diplomat, and his mother was from a notable wealthy Japanese family with samurai heritage. So very, very quite amazing sort of bloodline he had. But he was very, very entitled, and he promoted miscegnation, which is racial mixing, as a means of overcoming nationalism and tribal divisions, envisioning the future of Europe as a mixed race a continent, because practical idealism was really the key for understanding Kalergi's vision. And on page 27, he said, the man of the distant future will be a hybrid. He said today's races and classes will gradually disappear due to the elimination of space, time, and prejudice. This new race of the future, similar in appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the diversity of peoples with a diversity of individuals. Well, it's quite an interesting concept. He was never really, he didn't call it a plan himself, but what happened is it was adopted by the architects of the European Union later. Kalergi had close ties with many powerful figures. He had financial elite backers. Max Warburg, powerful banker from the Warburg banking family in Germany, funded his Pan-Europa project in the early days. And Baron Louis de Rothschild, the Austrian branch of the famous Rothschild family, also supported his efforts. And he did say that the European finances and intellectuals were an essential part of this vision of a united and post-national Europe. So Kalergi also had contacts in royal families like Otto von Habsburg, who later became president of the Pan-European Union. Now, the connection to the European Union is that Pan-Europa didn't become the EU. It deeply influenced the post-World War II architects of Europe. People like Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, he was the primary architect of the European coal and steel community, the precursor to the EU. And although he wasn't a Pan-Europa member, his vision mirrored Kalergi's goals of supranational control. So we've got all these different people adopted his ideology, particularly Peter Sutherland, who was, if we fast forward to the 20th and early 21st centuries, Peter Sutherland, often referred to as the father of globalization, he played a pivotal role in shaping policies that promoted European integration. He was a strong advocate for migration, viewing it as an essential for economic growth and cultural exchange with Europe. His work emphasised the importance of open borders and the free movement of people, aligning with the foundational principles of the Pan-European movement. The connections to the World Economic Forum and Agenda 2030, you've got the WEF, their whole global economic policies related to European integration and migration. And Peter Sutherland was an active participant in the WEF, contributing to the dialogues on immigration and its role in global development. So, we've got Agenda 2030 with the sustainable goals. This all links up. This goal resonates with the principles and advocated by Coudenhove clergy and later supported by figures like Sutherland. Sutherland was behind the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. And that was in 2018, I think. You've also got the International Office of Migration. We've got all these documents that prove that there is a concerted effort to bring this migration in. So the Pan-European Union, it does still exist today. It's headquartered in Austria, and it was officially recognised by the European Parliament in the 1970s as a forerunner of the EU. And we have the Charlemagne Prize, which is awarded to figures who promote European unity, and it was first given to Coudenhove clergy in 1950. And, if you look at the recipients of the Charlemagne Prize, it's given every year by the city of Aachen, and you can Google it. If you want to see those who've been, rewarded for EU unification, the Charlemagne Prize is really the place to be looking. And it's a bit of a rogues gallery, really. Charlemagne was the leader of the Frankish Empire, which later became the Holy Roman Empire, who were the first to unify Western Europe. So in 1956, you've got Winston Churchill. 1963, Edward Heath received the prize. 87, Henry Kissinger. 1999, Tony Blair. 2000, Bill Clinton. 2008, Angela Merkel. 2016, Pope Francis. 2018, Emmanuel Macron, and 2019, Antonio Guterres. And just lately, in 2023, Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian people were awarded it in 2023. In 2024, Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt and the Jewish Communities of Europe. And in 2025, Ursula von Leyen. So it is a bit of a rose gallery. And it's, the Global Compact for Migration, the United Nations Compact, that was led up by Peter Sutherland in 2018. So there is a direct link with the Coudenhove clergy's ideology, although there was no actual plan. And we've got the migration and the 2030 agenda, the migration, the International Office of Migration. So there is definitely enough evidence to prove that, yes, is there a plan? Well, yes, there is. And the thing is that we're sort of led to believe that we are being in some way racist or right wing in actually flagging this up and calling it out, because that we cannot sustain 1,000 people coming in a week, which is what it's looking as though it's building up to. So anyway, I don't know I've been looking also at the Indigenous Peoples Declaration, the human rights, and if there's any lawyers who can help us out here, because we are the Indigenous people of this country, and Indigenous people and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. And it states that people should be provided with effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for any action that has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. Any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories or resources, any form of forced population transfer, which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights, any form of forced assimilation or integration, any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. So, this is Article 8 of the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. So, if there's any lawyers out there who can sort of shine some light on that, because I think we're going to need to be able to fight back on this, because it's getting it's such a hot topic at the moment, and it's just being brought in against the wishes of the people. So
the wishes of people everywhere, Sandy, because of course it's not just in Europe or in the UK. It's let's move an entire population out of a part of the Middle East into some desert somewhere. It's right across the world. This is happening, and it is an area that needs to be looked at.
It is, the wishes of people ignored across the board. Plenty to continue with there. Now, if you like what the UK column does and you would like to support us, there are many ways in which you could do that. So please take a look at the website where you can make a donation. You can join as a monthly member or an annual member, or indeed a lifetime member. You can also go to the shop and look at a great range of UK column merchandise, or buy one of Clive de Carle's products, from which we receive a small percentage. Now, the critical part with all of our content is please that you do share it, because we are, as described in this programme, heavily censored. So you are, in effect, the algorithm for us. Now, a reminder that our first live event of this year starts on Saturday, the 5th of April in Cheltenham. Unfortunately, tickets for in-person seats have closed now, but don't worry, because you can join us on the live stream. And we very much hope that you will. Also, a reminder that you do not have to be watching the live stream as it goes out. You have access to it thereafter. So please consider that. Not many days to go. Now, tomorrow we have an interview going out with Carl Schwartz, an interview that Brian has conducted. He's the author of One Way Ticket to Crawford, Texas. A conservative Republican speaks out. And this concerns the attack on the World Trade Center, a day that few people can forget. But that day did not happen out of the blue, and in reality, the attack was a Pearl Harbor to justify a shift in Bush-Cheney oil strategy. Of course, trillions of dollars in oil and gas money being at stake there. So please do tune in to that interview at 1 o'clock tomorrow. And Mike can give us a quick brief on yesterday's interview with Catherine Austin-Fitts.
Yeah, if you didn't see that yesterday, do get a look at it. It's on the UK column website now. Catherine talking about Trump's continuing building of the technocratic infrastructure in the United States. She talks about CBDCs, about digital ID, and a whole bunch of other related topics. So please join us for that.
Indeed. And then in Lisbon, Northern Ireland, we've got coming up on Monday the 7th, a conference, What's Wrong with Sex Education? Obviously a theme that we've covered a lot in recent times, particularly with regard to interviews run by the Family Education Trust. So please do take a look at that. A great range of speakers, and no doubt a very worthy event, which takes us back to the idea of banking as a control mechanism, but I think this time for businesses.
Well, for censorship, amongst other things. So, over the years, we've been reporting on deplatforming of various people by the banks and by the payment processors. Nigel Farage, Coutts Bank is one example, if we can put that on screen. And PayPal, a serial offender with Consortium News, the Free Speech Union and Toby Young, and Mint Press, just to name a few. Let me introduce you to this website, Bad Banky. This has been produced by Talk Liberation, which is a privacy-focused software development organization which is building a new social media platform called Panquake. They've announced they're suing an Icelandic bank, Icelandsbanki, in court. Now joining me to discuss this today is John Kiriakou. John, I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. Welcome to the program. First of all, tell us about Talk Liberation and what you're doing with Panquake.
Talk Liberation is the parent company of Panquake. Panquake itself was established about 5 years ago, actually exactly 5 years ago, as a privacy and transparency focused social media platform. It's transformed into something bigger than that. It's transformed into something now that is designing software using open source code that would allow people to, for example, surf the internet without being tracked. The Panquake social media platform itself would allow people to do essentially what they do on any of the big platforms, but without being tracked, without being followed, without being sent to one place or another by algorithms, something that's completely transparent and yet protective of individual privacy.
So the bank in Iceland, what did they do, and what was the impact on the work that you were doing?
Well, back in 2002, the bank here in Iceland, Iceland Banki, arbitrarily, capriciously, simply froze Panquake's accounts without any explanation. It froze the accounts, which in turn froze the seed money, which in then turn froze development of all these wonderful products and services that the company was developing. They did this under counterterrorism and counter money laundering laws, but didn't provide any explanation. And then finally, just as arbitrarily, lifted the freeze and let the money go, which, when you think about it, is almost an admission that they did so improperly in the first place.
So when you say they let the money go, did they reinstate your bank account, or did you have to get a bank account somewhere else?
They reinstated the bank account, again, without any explanation at all. And so what we ended up doing at Panquake was hiring WikiLeaks attorneys here in Iceland to go after the bank. At the very least, we want an explanation as to why this happened, why they would interfere, and who put them up to it. Was this a decision that was taken by the bank itself? Was it taken by the Icelandic government? Was it taken by a foreign government or foreign entity asking the Icelanders to do such a thing? We just don't have any answers to these questions.
And I mean, holding on to somebody's money for 9 months, clearly intended to put them out of business. How have you managed to keep going, or how did you manage to keep going over that period of time then?
That's a great question. We were very fortunate to have investors who really were committed to the company. And so the additional money was able to make its way in, and we continued development. In fact, here we are, despite this setback, this multi-year setback, and we have almost 24 employees. Coding continues on, and we're ready to come out with multiple products.
So what kind of legal action are you intending to take?
Well, we're suing the bank, and I have to be honest with you, this has been a learning experience for me personally. I'm American. I'm not used to the Icelandic method of justice. I only learned recently, when I went to one of the preliminary hearings here in Reykjavik, that the justice system here is set up on what they describe as the German model. So there's no discovery in the American sense, in that you can't have the judge command that the other side turn over relevant documents, for example. You almost have to have a premonition that there are documents out there related to the case, and you have to specifically ask for them. And then you go into court and you say, we want documents A, B, C, and D. The judge turns and says to the other side, do you have such documents? They say yes or no. If the answer is no, then you're out of luck. If the answer is yes, you may get your documents. So it's very drawn out, and it's almost as though the deck is stacked. But it also then gives you a sense of how right WikiLeaks was to finally force a settlement in its case, and how right so far Panquake is that the bank backed off in the first place and released the funds.
So are you optimistic?
We are optimistic. The thing is right and wrong is wrong. And we knew from the beginning that we were right. We knew that there were powerful forces against us, whether they were here in Iceland or in the United States or in Europe. We knew we would have to fight these fights. And these fights have presented themselves. We have won so far. We are willing to not just go forward here in Iceland, but go forward until the bitter end. And we're confident we're going to come out ahead. Okay,
well, we'll wish you all the best on that. I'm going to say, John, thank you very much for joining us today. Details of the websites will be in the show notes, of course, and hopefully we'll hear more from you in the not-too-distant future. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Mike. Now we'll go back to Vanessa, where we will look at how the Trump regime continues to stir things up in Yemen.
Yeah, Trump is saber rattling all over West Asia and, of course, with Iran, but particularly in Yemen. So this is what he put out a couple of days ago. The Iran-backed Houthi terrorists have been decimated by the relentless strikes over the past 2 weeks. Many of their fighters and leaders are no longer with us. We hit them day and night, harder and harder. Their capabilities that threaten shipping in the region are rapidly being destroyed. Our attacks will continue until they are no longer a threat to freedom of navigation. Quite extraordinary that this is how he's framed it. The choice for the Houthis is clear: stop shooting at US ships and we will stop shooting at you. Otherwise, we have only just begun, and the real pain is yet to come for both the Houthis and their sponsors in Iran. So the usual belligerent hubris there from Trump. He then also has posted on X about a telephone call with President el-Sisi of Egypt, which he says went very well. We discussed numerous topics, among which was the tremendous military progress. I'll underline that we have made against the ship-destroying Houthis in Yemen. Also discussed was Gaza and possible solutions, military preparedness, etc. Now, of course, we know that Trump has been putting pressure on both Egypt and Jordan to basically take in enforced Gazan refugees, while the genocide by Israel is being ramped up since. Of course, Trump has provided them with the bombs that were actually frozen under the Biden administration. But however, what Trump is doing in Yemen, of course, is that he's using the B-2 bombers that were deployed to Diego Garcia Island that we talked about last week to bomb effectively civilian infrastructure, while claiming, of course, to be targeting the underground manufacturing facilities in Yemen of weapons and missiles. And in the most recent bombing campaign, which was yesterday by the US and the UK, Al Mayadeen's correspondent says that the US airstrikes target the Water Authority building in Al Mansouriya district, southeast of Hodeidah province, which is on the western coast of Yemen on the Red Sea. And of course, this is what the US does traditionally. It's what Israel has been doing, both in Syria and in Lebanon. But the fact that Trump is claiming overwhelming force is bringing him victory against Yemen is effectively being contradicted by the reports being put out by both partisan media with the resistance and by the Yemeni military spokespeople. So first of all, the Yemeni armed forces have claimed to have targeted US carrier E-2 AEW aircraft, which is their early warning airborne aircraft, which provides them with critical intelligence on potential threats to the USS Truman, and provides them with essential surveillance and tracking. Now, that plane is deemed to have been damaged beyond repair by the Yemeni military. It's also notable that even in American media and even American military experts have been putting out statements confirming basically that Yemen is giving them a pretty hard time on the battlefront. And more recently, Yemeni forces engaged in 3 battles with the US Navy. This is another statement by General Yahya Sari, who said that Yemeni attacks against US Navy vessels will continue to escalate progressively. And of course, we need a reminder, I think, why Yemen began this blockade of the Red Sea. Of course, it was under the Article 1 and 2 of the Geneva Convention on Genocide to both prevent and punish genocide by the Zionists against the Palestinians, both in the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza. And just to give an example of how that is ongoing, in the last few days, Palestinian paramedics shot by the IOF had their hands tied. So mass graves have effectively been found with Palestinian paramedics shot in the head or executed and then buried in mass graves. And of course, what the Yemenis are most against is also the siege of Gaza, which includes the deliberate starvation. And I just wanted to play this video, which also reminds us what we are fighting against. And I think it relates intrinsically to what Roger Waters was also saying in his speech, but it also demonstrates why the Yemenis are doing what they are doing and how effectively what Trump is doing against the Yemenis is sustaining genocide by the Israeli state, or non-state, as I would say. So let's just play this video very quickly. So this is effectively what Trump is defending with his mass deployment to Diego Garcia and his bombardment of Yemen.
As you say, sustaining genocide. Vanessa, thank you very much indeed. Now, Sandy, back to you, and I think an insight into the valuation of agricultural Armageddon.
Yes, another nail in the coffin for, it seems to be the destruction of British farming yet again. A company called Bidstats, who are agricultural valuation company, have been tasked by the government to value livestock, crops, agricultural plant equipment, and other similar assets. And they're recruiting at the moment, and they're required to enable government to pay compensation to owners of animals, crops, equipment, etc. when we order the destruction of their property, if we order the culling of animals with diseases such as TB, avian flu, or foot and mouth. So this is an absolute admission that it's farm seizure, really, of equipment, livestock, and the destruction of farming. So it's very interesting. They've put up an advert that they're recruiting for valuers now to do this stuff. And it's they've renewed their contract, and this is the renewal of that contract, 2025 renewal of that contract. So this is what we're looking at. If they push through the fake PCR tests and good, healthy cattle, potentially could die because they're just literally going for the farmers and going for the livestock and the equipment. So I just feel that needed flagging up. I did put it on X, and quite a few people have picked it up. But this is another reason why farmers really should be looking at whether they allow this to happen. Do they just say no? Because I can see this as being potentially a massive nail in the coffin of the agricultural industry.
Indeed, yes. I mean, redolent of the preparations in 2000 for what was described as an outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001, as documented in Slaughtered on Suspicion on the UK Column website. Sandy, thank you very much indeed. Now, that moves us, again, away from the land, but into the arena of gene editing. And on Monday of this week, the Delegated Legislation Committee of the House of Commons debated the draft genetic technology regulations, the secondary legislation on what is described as precision breeding. And this follows the General Act of the same name of 2023. The Permanent Undersecretary, Emma Hardy, describes the draft as an enabling regulatory framework, which brings to mind the compromise and corruption of the MHRA, a connection which is more relevant than ever, considering that we're looking at altering the genetic makeup of organisms. DEFRA is trying to sell this as a technology which reduces costs to business and encourages innovation and investment in the development of precision-bred organisms. At the same time, it's insisting that the proposed regulatory approach will be more proportionate to risk, but it's not quite clear more proportionate than what. Unwilling to concede that there may be any downside to this technology, DEFRA goes on to suggest that gene editing could help to develop crops with improved nutritional value, resistance to disease, and resilience to climate change. Note the word could. To get a sense of where this is going, it's worth looking back at the progression of the narrative. And here's a video put out by the Royal Society 8 years ago.
First, let's look at the positives. Gene editing could make radical improvements to human health. For example, in 2015, doctors used genome editing techniques to cure a baby girl's leukemia. In the future, we may be able to fix the gene mutations that predispose some people to cancer, or enable new therapies for HIV, or edit the genes that cause hereditary diseases. In the plant world, it could make crops more nutritious, disease-resistant, and able to grow in difficult conditions. By editing animals' genes, we could help them resist diseases. Scientists are currently working to edit the genes of mosquitoes to prevent them from carrying malaria. So genome editing has enormous positive potential. But what about possible downsides? Genes could be edited in early human embryos to alter characteristics such as eye colour that have no bearing on health. This raises the possibility of designer babies. And changing an embryo's DNA would not only affect the child, but their descendants too. These same techniques could also be used to create designer pets, or develop more virulent microbial diseases. So, alongside the many benefits of genome editing, there are also some ethical and societal concerns to consider. The technology is already in our hands. Now's the time to debate how we use it, regulate it, avoid negative uses, and unlock its potential to provide life-changing solutions to some of the world's biggest challenges.
There we go. It seems quite clear that the key message to be taken away is that if we improve our nutrition via improving the growing conditions of our plants and animals, we'll then be able to convert those benefits by tinkering around with our own genetic composition for the greater good. Of course, all of this is predicated on the assumption that the description of precision breeding is actually accurate. And as it stands, we're told that the results of gene editing may only contain genetic features that could have resulted from traditional breeding processes, and that the editing itself is just an acceleration of other processes. So even if taken at face value, the law of unintended consequences will have its part to play, and this means that nobody can possibly know the medium to long-term outcomes. What is barely ever referred to is the response of the environment to the precision-bred organism. The focus is always on the breeding technology and not on the consequences to the food chain either side of the organism in question. Now, the reason for making this point is that it's always stated as an absolute truth that gene editing should be regarded as completely separate from the modification of genetic organisms, in that GMO may introduce genetic material from unrelated species, but given the complete uncertainty over the outcomes and the constant use of conditional language such as could, this distinction is semantic rather more than legitimate. Anyway, back to Parliament. Emma Hardy attempted to brush off the work of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee of the House of Lords, which had written in late March that this is a, quote, complex and sensitive policy area about which there are strongly held views, and that concerns have been raised about the lack of labelling requirements, despite apparent strong consumer preferences for mandatory labelling of products containing precision-bred organisms, and the impact of the new regulatory approach on trade and on organic producers, end quote. This roughly translates as a deeply held suspicion by the public, both of the products themselves and the way in which the government may manipulate outcomes for consumer and producer alike. The other focus for the messaging on this debate is that the only reason animals are succumbing to the well-publicised diseases such as foot and mouth, blue tongue and bird flu is that the animals themselves are defective and in need of updating or upgrading. This has the twin effect of ignoring the conditions that they're kept in, as well as impregnating the public consciousness with the idea that eliminating disease via gene editing is something which could and should be applied to humans too. So I think we'll have more to discuss on this in Extra, especially the potential for any of this regulation to be weaponized in such a way that only gene-edited or cultured food is permissible, especially since all of this technology is currently banned in the European Union. And finally, of course, there is the question, which is almost never asked, what if things do not turn out well? How does DEFRA or anyone else reckon on stuffing the genie back in the lamp? Here a piece from the Health and Safety Executive about an accidental release for a GMO, admittedly significant and unintended release of GMO, and which presents an immediate or delayed risk to human health or the environment. Plenty to think about, and it deserves a great deal more scrutiny. Now, this takes us back to Vanessa, where we are going to look at what's going on in Lebanon.
Yeah, Israel yet again violating the ceasefire and the UN resolution 1701 by bombing north of the Litani River. This is from Hala Jabba on X. Israel bombed Beirut again. This was yesterday at 4 a.m. Twice in 1 week at 4 a.m. while people slept and there was no warning. Warplanes struck a building in the southern suburbs, no warning and no justification. 3 people, including a woman, I think that's now 4 people, I think 1 person succumbed to their wounds, were killed, 7 others were injured. Once again, Israel brazenly violates UN Resolution 1701 because impunity is the only rule it follows. So let's have a look at the first attack that she's talking about. This warning was actually put out by the Zionist military, basically an urgent warning. This was in the middle of the day on Monday, and the red square there is the building that was supposed to be evacuated, but you can actually see that there were 2 schools in very close proximity, the Lycée des Arts and St. George's School, and there was actual mass panic because the children in those schools had very, very little time to be evacuated. There was footage of children panicking and screaming, trying to leave the school in time before the adjacent building was bombed and obliterated. And this is a very short video of the attack at 4 a.m. yesterday morning. As you can imagine, this is showing the damage to the building. But this was at 4 a.m. when people were fast asleep. And as a friend of mine said, she woke up, she wasn't aware it had been happening, but she was receiving hundreds of texts at that time of the morning. This is in southern Beirut. Nabi Berri, who's a parliament speaker, he says it quite succinctly. Above all, this is an Israeli attempt using fire, blood, and destruction to assassinate the UN Resolution 1701 and undermine its implementation mechanism, which is included in the agreement. Lebanon has fully complied with it, and that, of course, includes Hezbollah. And I think what's also particularly interesting, in addition to Israel effectively bombing Lebanon with impunity, satellite images, which have actually been released by the New York Times of all media outlets, reveal a growing network of Israeli outposts in both Lebanon and Syria. And if we have a look at one of the photos in the NYT article, you can see the extent to which Israel is effectively digging into southern Syrian territory and also into southern Lebanese territory. Although as part of the ceasefire, of course, there should have been full withdrawal of Israeli forces. And in fact, the exact opposite to that, this was actually on my Telegram channel yesterday towards the end of the afternoon. In the past 2 hours, enemy Israeli attacks targeted several border areas, machine gun bursts targeted the southern outskirts of the town of Aitarun, more machine gun bursts in the vicinity of other towns in the south and in Chiba. And then basically, along with the machine gun sweeping operations, with the sounds of Israeli tanks moving into southern Lebanon. So this is in direct violation of the ceasefire, of course. And then on top of that, let's just have a look at this section from the article in the NYT, which shows very clearly the red circle is the area that I've just been talking about, where Israeli tanks are basically coming into Lebanese territory. But you can see very clearly there. I mean, if you freeze frame and have a look at the photos or go to the article, which will be in the show notes, you can see the development of effectively settlements by Israel, both in southern Lebanon, by the 5 highest points that we've talked about many times on UK column, and in southern Syria, extending towards southern Damascus, the suburbs of Damascus. So, Israel continues with impunity, bombing civilian residential areas, violating ceasefires, as of course it's always done in Palestine. And Trump is doing absolutely nothing to stop it. In fact, what he's doing is, as we said, sustaining the criminality of Israel.
Indeed, yeah. Unfortunately, very consistent in the way that they conduct themselves, at least the Trump regime and indeed the state of Israel. Unfortunately, not time to go into that further now, but we definitely will in extra. So that we'll have to close the programme out there. But please remember the Catherine Austin Fitz interview from yesterday, and indeed to look forward to the Carl Schwartz interview going out at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Also, may I encourage you to go ahead and buy that live stream ticket for the Cheltenham event on Saturday, this Saturday. And again, to reiterate, you don't need to watch it at the time, but you will have access to it thereafter. So we'll look forward to seeing you either in person or indeed on the end of a live stream. So it just remains for me to thank Mike very much for being here in the studio with me, and Vanessa and Sandy for joining by live link, and indeed John Kiriakou for joining from Iceland. If you are a UK column member, please stay on the line and we'll see you in a few minutes for extra. Otherwise, the news will resume on Friday at 1 o'clock. See you then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.